Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange, oddly strict, and surprisingly genius world of ancient Egypt, a land of pyramids, gods, and rules that sound completely ridiculous. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you wake up in ancient Egypt as a priest, your morning does not begin with a peaceful stretch or a moment of quiet reflection. It begins with a blade, and not in a heroic cinematic way, in a very personal, very thorough, and slightly uncomfortable way, because your first task is to remove every single hair from your body. Head, beard, eyebrows, arms, legs. If it exists, it is no longer welcome. Which sounds excessive, and it is. But also, it's kind of genius, because you are living in a place where the heat is relentless, the dust is everywhere, and the insects are not just annoying, they are ambitious. They are organised. They are fully committed to making you their long-term residents. And hair? Hair is prime real estate. It traps sweat. It collects dirt. It creates a cozy little environment where parasites can settle down, raise a family, and absolutely ruin your day without asking for permission. So when the priests talk about purity, they are not just talking about pleasing the gods. They are talking about not becoming a walking apartment complex for things with too many legs. And suddenly, this whole shaving situation starts to feel less like a spiritual overreaction and more like aggressive pest control. You shave regularly, carefully. There is no, I'll skip today. There is no, it's just a little stubble. Because in this environment, a little stubble is basically an open invitation. And the worst part? You have to shave your eyebrows. Which means you are now permanently one bad decision away from looking surprised for the rest of your life. But again, there's a reason. Removing hair makes it easier to wash, easier to stay clean, and significantly harder for parasites to hide. It cools your body, reduces irritation, and keeps you in a state that is, for lack of a better word, manageable. So yes, it looks extreme. Yes, it sounds uncomfortable. Yes, you will absolutely question your life choices at some point during the process. But when the alternative is itching, infection, and sharing your body with creatures that did not ask for permission, you start to understand. You're not shaving for style. You're shaving for survival. And honestly, when the choice is between dignity and not being eaten alive by microscopic freeloaders, you're going to pick the razor. Now that you've shaved everything, and are probably still questioning your career choices, you move on to the next rule. You wash. Constantly. Not once a day. Not even twice. Multiple times. And not casually either. This is structured, repeated, and taken very seriously, especially if you're a priest. Which means your job now includes being both spiritually pure and aggressively clean at all times. Which sounds exhausting. And it is. But also, it's keeping you alive, because you are living next to the Nile River, a river that gives life, feeds crops, supports civilization, and also contains things you absolutely do not want inside your body. Bacteria, parasites, tiny invisible problems that, in ancient times, had a very effective way of ending your story early. So while the Egyptians didn't have microscopes, they had something just as useful. Pattern recognition. They noticed that people who stayed clean stayed healthier. People who did not have a great time. And instead of debating it endlessly, they turned it into a rule. Wash often, no excuses. Before rituals, after rituals, before eating, after eating, after walking outside for 5 minutes and existing in general, you wash again, which at first feels like overkill. But then you remember, you are covered in dust, sweat, and whatever the wind decided to throw at you that day. So maybe it's not overkill, maybe it's just realistic. And since you already shaved your entire body, washing becomes much easier. No hair means less dirt sticking around, fewer places for anything unpleasant to hide, and a much quicker process overall. So congratulations, your extreme grooming routine is now paying off. Emotionally, debatable. Functionally, very effective. Of course, this constant washing also reinforces something else. Discipline. because this isn't about comfort. It's about consistency. Doing the same thing the same way every day without skipping steps, which is basically the entire foundation of Egyptian society. Order, routine, control. So while it might feel like you're just endlessly rinsing yourself like a very committed human dish, you're actually participating in something bigger. A system designed to keep people clean, healthy, and most importantly, predictable. And in a world where chaos could mean disease, famine, or worse, being predictable was a very good thing. So yes, you wash constantly, not because it's relaxing, but because the alternative is significantly worse. And honestly, after a while, you probably stop noticing, which is good, because you're going to be doing this a lot. So now you're clean, completely shaved, aggressively washed, probably glowing like a very disciplined statue. And naturally, you get hungry, which should be simple. You live next to the Nile River. There are fish everywhere. Swimming, available. Practically offering themselves as dinner. Perfect. Except, not all of them. Because in ancient Egypt, certain fish are strictly off limits. Forbidden. Not even a just this once situation. More like a don't ask questions, just don't eat it kind of rule. Which feels unfair, until you think about it for more than 5 seconds. Because here's what those fish are doing all day. They are swimming in a river that also serves as a water source, transportation route, and occasionally a very convenient place for people and animals to dispose of things they don't want to think about anymore. And some fish, they eat that. They eat waste. They eat decaying matter. They eat whatever they find floating or sinking that vaguely resembles food. Which means when you eat those fish, you're not just eating fish, you're eating everything the fish ate. And suddenly, this rule stops feeling like a strange religious restriction and starts feeling like the ancient version of maybe don't eat that, it looks suspicious. Because again, the Egyptians didn't have microscopes. They didn't know about bacteria in the modern sense, but they did notice patterns. They noticed that people who ate certain types of fish got sick more often. Not immediately, not always dramatically, but enough to raise concern. And instead of writing a long scientific paper about it, they did something much more efficient. They banned it. No debates. No exceptions. No I'll risk it. Just a rule. And if you're living in that system, you follow it. Because you've already shaved your body to avoid parasites, you've washed yourself 10 times today to stay clean, you're probably not going to ruin all that effort by eating something questionable, at least not on purpose. So yes, from the outside, it looks strange. Selective eating rules. Specific fish banned for reasons that sound vaguely mystical, but in reality, it's quality control. Very strict, very effective, slightly dramatic quality control. And honestly, when your entire civilization depends on staying healthy in a very unforgiving environment, being a little dramatic about food safety is probably a good idea, because one bad meal here doesn't just ruin your evening, it might ruin your week, or worse. So you listen, you look at the fish, and you think, maybe not that one. At some point during your very clean, very controlled life, you notice something interesting. Cats are everywhere, not just casually wandering around like they own the place, but treated with a level of respect that feels slightly excessive. And then you learn the rule. You do not harm a cat. At all. Not accidentally. Not it scratched me first. Not even in a moment of frustration when it knocks something over for the 3rd time that day. Which, let's be honest, is extremely on brand for cats. Because in ancient Egypt, harming a cat is a serious offence. And not in a you'll get a warning kind of way. In a this could go very badly for you, very quickly kind of way. Which feels intense until you realise what cats actually do. Because cats are not just pets. They are part of your survival system. They control pests, rats, mice, snakes, creatures that have a very strong interest in your grain supply. And your grain supply is not just food. It's stability. It's economy. It's the difference between a functioning society and a very uncomfortable collapse. So when a cat walks into a storage area and casually eliminates a rodent problem, it's not just being helpful. It's protecting your future. And suddenly, that overreaction starts to make a lot more sense. Because if you allow people to harm cats, even occasionally, you risk reducing the one thing that keeps your food supply safe, which means more pests, which means less food, which means problems. Big ones. So instead of explaining all of this every time someone gets annoyed at a cat, you create a rule, a very strong rule. Do not harm them, ever. And to reinforce it, you tie it to something even more powerful. Religion. Cats are associated with the goddess Bastet, protector of home, fertility, and, conveniently, cats themselves. So now, harming a cat isn't just a practical mistake, it's a spiritual one, which makes people take it much more seriously, because people might ignore practical advice, but they rarely ignore divine consequences. So you adjust, you step carefully around cats, you tolerate their behaviour, you accept that if a cat decides your belongings now belong to it, that's just how things are. Because the alternative is far worse, and honestly, once you understand the system, you start to see it differently. You're not just living with cats, you're living under their protection, and possibly their supervision, which, given their personalities, is a little concerning, but also very effective. At some point, you notice something else. Everyone is wearing makeup, not just the wealthy, not just women. Everyone, men, priests, workers. If you have eyes, chances are they are outlined in thick, dark lines that make you look like you are permanently ready for a dramatic close-up. And naturally, you assume this is about appearance, style, status, looking impressive. Which, yes, that's part of it. But not the main part, because in ancient Egypt, that heavy eye makeup, called kohl, is doing something much more important than making you look mysterious. It's protecting you. From the sun, first of all. The Egyptian sun is not gentle. It reflects off sand, water, and everything in between, creating a glare that can make it difficult to see and very easy to strain your eyes. That dark kohl around your eyes, it reduces glare, which means you can actually function without squinting your way through the day like you've made several poor life decisions. But it doesn't stop there, because kohl also helps protect against infections. The ingredients, often containing minerals like galena, had mild antibacterial properties. Not because the Egyptians fully understood bacteria in the modern sense, but because they observed something very simple. People who used it had fewer eye problems. And eye problems in this environment? Not a minor inconvenience. Dust, sand, wind, all constantly trying to irritate your eyes, dry them out, or introduce something unpleasant that could lead to infection. So this cosmetic becomes a barrier, a shield, a very stylish, slightly dramatic shield. Of course, there's also the religious angle. Eye makeup was associated with protection from evil, often linked to symbols like the Eye of Horus. So now you're not just protecting your vision physically, you're protecting it spiritually, which means this one habit covers multiple layers of Egyptian life, practical, medical, and symbolic. And because it works on all levels, it becomes universal. You don't question it. You apply it daily, carefully, possibly while still adjusting to the fact that you have no eyebrows left from chapter 1, but at least now your eyes are protected from the sun, from infection, and possibly from whatever invisible forces the gods are managing that day. So yes, from the outside it looks like everyone is just very committed to eyeliner, but in reality, you are participating in one of the earliest forms of functional medicine, which also happens to look good, and honestly, that's a rare combination, even by modern standards. At some point you find yourself in the presence of the most powerful person in Egypt, the ruler, the king, the living god, the pharaoh, and naturally, your first instinct, if you're a normal human being, is to behave normally. Maybe step forward, maybe gesture, maybe, in a moment of confusion, reach out slightly like you would when greeting anyone else. This would be a mistake, because in ancient Egypt you do not touch the pharaoh at all, not casually, not respectfully, not even by accident if you can help it, because the pharaoh is not just a political leader. He is considered divine, a living link between the gods and the people, a physical embodiment of order, balance, and cosmic stability, which means touching him isn't just inappropriate, it's complicated. Religiously, it risks impurity. You, despite your aggressive shaving and constant washing, are still just a person, and contact with the divine is not something to be handled casually. But beyond religion, there's something else happening here. Control. Distance creates authority. The less accessible a ruler is, the more powerful they appear. The more untouchable they seem, the less likely anyone is to forget their position. So this rule isn't just about protecting the pharaoh from you. It's about protecting the idea of the pharaoh from everyone, because once a ruler becomes just another person, things start to slip. Respect weakens, obedience becomes optional, and in a civilization built entirely on order, that's not a risk worth taking. So instead you maintain distance. You bow. You speak when spoken to. You exist in the same space, but not in the same way, and over time this becomes normal. You stop thinking of the pharaoh as someone you interact with, and start thinking of him as something you orbit, which is exactly the point. Because power in ancient Egypt is not just enforced, it's performed. Every gesture, every rule, every carefully maintained distance reinforces the same message. This is not an ordinary man. This is something higher, something beyond reach. And whether you fully believe that or not, you act like you do because the system depends on it. And also because testing that rule personally is probably not a great idea. So you keep your distance, you keep your hands to yourself, and you very quickly learn that in Egypt, some lines are not meant to be crossed, especially not physically. At some point, you realize something slightly unsettling. You cannot read, not because you're incapable, not because you didn't try hard enough as a child, but because in ancient Egypt, reading and writing are not normal skills. They are privileges, and very controlled ones, because writing, hieroglyphs, administrative records, religious texts, is handled by a very specific group of people. Scribes. And scribes are not just people who write things down. They are trained professionals, educated, disciplined, and most importantly trusted, which immediately tells you something. Writing equals power, because whoever controls writing controls records, taxes, laws, history, basically everything that defines how a society functions and remembers itself. And Egypt understands this very clearly. So instead of teaching everyone to read and write, which sounds nice in theory but slightly chaotic in practice, they restrict it heavily. If you're not trained as a scribe, you rely on them. You trust them to record what you owe, what you own, what you've done, and sometimes what you allegedly did, which is a lot of responsibility for one group of people, but also very efficient. Because it centralizes control, you don't have thousands of individuals writing their own versions of reality. You have a system, structured, consistent, managed. Of course, becoming a scribe is not easy. It requires years of training, discipline, and the ability to memorize a writing system that looks like someone decided pictures should also be words, which is impressive and slightly intimidating. But once you achieve it, your life improves dramatically. You avoid manual labor. You gain status. You become part of the administrative backbone of the entire civilization. In other words, you upgrade significantly. Meanwhile, if you're not a scribe, you accept your role. You focus on your work, your routine, your very clean and hairless existence, and you let someone else handle the writing, because questioning the system doesn't change it, and trying to fake literacy in a society where writing is sacred and highly monitored, that's not a great long-term plan. So yes, from the outside it might seem unfair. Limited access to knowledge, strict control over information, but from the inside, it's stability, because when information is controlled, the system stays consistent. And in a civilization that values order above everything else, consistency is everything. Even if it means you never quite understand what's written on that wall next to you. At some point, you come face to face with a rule that feels less like a daily inconvenience and more like a long-term commitment. Death does not end your responsibilities. In fact, it makes them significantly more complicated. Because in ancient Egypt, you don't just bury the dead. You preserve them carefully, thoroughly, almost obsessively, which at first seems like a lot of effort for someone who is technically no longer participating in daily activities. But then you learn the reasoning. The Egyptians believed that the soul, the ka and ba, needs a body to return to, not symbolically, not metaphorically, physically. Which means if your body decays, your afterlife becomes a problem, a very permanent problem. So naturally, the solution is simple. Stop the body from decaying, which is where mummification comes in. And if you're imagining a quick process, maybe a respectful wrapping and a quiet burial, no, this is detailed. They remove internal organs. They dry the body using natron, a natural salt that pulls out moisture. They wrap everything carefully, layer by layer, preserving the shape, the structure, the the identity, all to ensure that when your soul returns, there is something left to come back to. Now, from your perspective, this is either incredibly reassuring or deeply concerning, because it means your body is now part of a long-term project that will outlast everyone you know. But beyond belief, there's something else happening here: observation. Because even without modern science, the Egyptians understand something critical. Decay comes from moisture. Remove the moisture, and you slow the process dramatically. Which is not just spiritual, it's practical. It's early chemistry, early anatomy, early experimentation, refined over generations until it becomes a system, a very effective system. Of course, this also means your burial is no longer simple. It's planned, prepared, organized, because preserving your body requires time, resources, and skill. And if done correctly, you don't just disappear, you endure. So yes, from the outside, it looks strange. An entire culture focused on preserving the dead with incredible precision. But from the inside, it makes perfect sense. Because if your existence continues after death, then your body is not just a memory, it's an investment. And like any important investment, you protect it. Even if that means turning yourself into the most carefully wrapped version of you that has ever existed. Now that your body has been carefully preserved, dried, wrapped and prepared like the most high-effort long-term project imaginable, you might assume the hard part is over. It's not. Because now comes the next rule. You don't just bury the dead. You protect them, aggressively. Because in ancient Egypt, your tomb is not a quiet resting place. It is a vault, and everything inside it, your jewelry, your food offerings, your carefully selected items for the afterlife, is not decoration. It's essential. Because you're not just being buried with valuables. You're being buried with everything you'll need for eternity, which immediately creates a problem. Other people also know that, and some of those people are less respectful about your afterlife plans. Grave robbers are very real, very motivated, and very interested in the idea that someone has conveniently stored a lifetime of wealth in one location and then left it completely unattended, which, from their perspective, feels like an opportunity. From your perspective, a disaster. Because if those items are taken, your afterlife becomes under-equipped. And no one wants to enter eternity unprepared. So the Egyptians respond in the most logical way possible. They turn tombs into security systems. Hidden entrances, false doors, traps, complex layouts designed not just to impress, but to confuse, mislead, and, ideally, stop anyone trying to break in. Some tombs are sealed so well that finding the actual burial chamber becomes a challenge in itself. Others are designed to make intruders think they've reached the end, when they're actually nowhere near it. It's less final resting place and more eternal anti-theft strategy. And honestly, it's effective. Because the harder you make it to access something, the less likely someone is to succeed. Or at least, the more effort they'll have to invest. Of course, not all tombs remain untouched. History has shown that determined people with enough time and motivation can eventually get through almost anything. But the goal isn't perfection. It's protection. It's buying time. And in some cases, it works so well that tombs remain hidden for thousands of years, until someone accidentally discovers them and realizes they've just walked into a very old, very well-designed security system. So yes, it might seem excessive. Traps, hidden chambers, false passages. But when your entire afterlife depends on what's inside that tomb, you don't take chances. You build defenses, because in ancient Egypt, even in death, you're still protecting what's yours. By now, you've shaved everything, washed constantly, avoided questionable fish, respected cats, protected your eyes, kept your distance from the pharaoh, accepted your illiteracy, prepared your body for eternity, and secured your tomb like a paranoid architect. So naturally, you might think the rest of life is a bit more relaxed. It isn't. Because if you are a worker in ancient Egypt, whether you're building temples, hauling stone, or working on something that will eventually confuse archaeologists for centuries, your life is also governed by rules. Very clear ones, very structured ones. Because large-scale construction does not happen by accident. It happens through organization. You have schedules. You have assigned tasks. You have food rations that are carefully distributed so you don't collapse halfway through moving something that absolutely should not be movable. And surprisingly, you are taken care of. Not out of kindness, out of necessity. Because a workforce that is sick, starving, or disorganized builds nothing. And Egypt is very interested in building things. Large things. Very large things. So instead of pushing people until they break, the system maintains them. Workers receive food, rest periods, even basic medical attention when needed. Which is not generosity, it's efficiency. Because if you keep people functioning, they keep the system functioning. And the system, as you've probably noticed by now, is everything. Of course, this doesn't mean the work is easy. It's physically demanding, repetitive, sometimes dangerous. You are still lifting, carrying, and coordinating on a scale that would make most modern people reconsider their life choices. But you're not doing it randomly. You're doing it within a system that is designed to keep everything moving, predictably, consistently, without chaos. Because chaos in a project like this is not just inconvenient, it's catastrophic. One mistake, one breakdown in coordination, and suddenly nothing aligns. Materials don't arrive, workers get injured, progress stops. And Egypt does not like things that stop, so rules exist. Clear instructions, defined roles, expected behaviour. You show up, you do your part, you follow the system, and in return, the system keeps going. Which, when you step back, is the reason any of this exists at all. The pyramids, the temples, the monuments. None of them happen without this level of control. So while it might feel strict, it's also what makes the impossible possible. Because in ancient Egypt, order doesn't just maintain life, it builds it. One very heavy stone at a time. At some point, despite your best efforts, shaving everything, washing constantly, avoiding suspicious fish, and respecting cats like they run the place, you still manage to get injured, because you are human, and also because lifting massive stones or simply existing in a harsh environment comes with consequences. Now, in many ancient settings, this would be the moment where people gather around, look concerned, and collectively hope for the best. But in ancient Egypt, things are slightly better. You have doctors, actual doctors. They're trained, they specialise. Some focus on wounds, others on internal issues, others on things that are described in ways that sound vague, but are surprisingly accurate for the time, which is already impressive, because instead of pure guesswork, there is observation, documentation, experience passed down and refined over generations. If you cut yourself, they clean the wound. If you break something, they attempt to stabilise it. If you're sick, they prescribe treatments, herbs, ointments, and occasionally something that sounds questionable, but has been used enough times to suggest it works. At least sometimes. And yes, there's still a mix of magic and medicine. Spells, prayers, protective rituals, all part of the process. But here's the interesting part. They don't replace treatment. They accompany it, which means Egyptian medicine operates on two levels, physical and spiritual. You treat the body, and you address whatever unseen forces might be involved, just in case, which honestly is a very thorough approach. Of course, not everything works perfectly. This is still ancient medicine. There are limits. There are misunderstandings. There are treatments that probably worked more because people believed in them than because they were scientifically effective. But compared to simply doing nothing, this is a major step forward. Because the key difference is intent. They are trying. They are observing patterns, recording outcomes, adjusting methods, building something that resembles a system rather than a collection of random guesses. And that system matters, because it increases survival, even slightly. And in a world where survival is never guaranteed, even a small improvement is significant. So when you get injured, you're not left entirely to chance. You have options. Imperfect options, sometimes uncomfortable options, occasionally confusing options, but options nonetheless. And in ancient Egypt, that's enough to make medicine feel almost advanced, which is a strange thing to say while someone is applying a mixture of herbs and reciting a protective spell over your wound. But if it works, you're not going to argue. By now you've probably noticed a pattern. You shave, you wash, you avoid certain foods. You follow rules about animals, rulers, writing, death, work, and even how you get treated when injured. And none of it feels random. That's because it isn't. Everything in ancient Egypt revolves around one central idea, ma'at, which at first glance sounds simple: order, balance, harmony. But in practice, it is everything. Because ma'at is not just a concept, it is the reason your entire society functions. Without it, things don't just get messy. They collapse. The Nile floods at the wrong time. Crops fail. Trade breaks down. People stop following rules. Authority weakens. And suddenly, the carefully structured world you live in turns into something much less predictable, which is exactly what the Egyptians are trying to avoid at all costs. So every rule you've encountered so far, no matter how strange, feeds into this one goal: maintain order. Because order keeps everything working. And if everything keeps working, you survive. Simple. Of course, this also means your personal behavior matters more than you might expect. You are not just an individual making choices. You are part of a system. And if you step out of line, if you ignore rules, disrupt routines, create imbalance, you are not just causing a small problem. You are contributing to chaos, which is a much bigger problem. So naturally, the solution is clear. You follow the rules, even the ones that seem unnecessary, even the ones that feel excessive, because they are not just about you. They are about maintaining a fragile balance that affects everyone. And this idea extends beyond life, into death, into the afterlife. Even your heart is weighed against Ma'at to determine whether you are worthy of continuing your journey. Which means this is not something you can ignore, ever. So yes, it might feel strict, structured, relentless. But there's a reason for that. Because in a world where nature itself can be unpredictable, floods, heat, disease, the only thing you can control is your system. And Egypt has decided to control it very carefully. So you adapt, you follow the rules, you maintain order. Because the alternative is not just inconvenience, it's collapse. And honestly, after everything you've seen so far, collapse is not something you're interested in experiencing firsthand. By now you've learned the rules. You shave, you wash, you eat carefully, you respect cats, you don't touch the pharaoh. You follow structure, routine, and the quiet pressure of Ma'at, holding everything together like a very strict invisible supervisor. So naturally you might ask, what happens if you don't? And this is where things get less comfortable. Because in ancient Egypt, rules are not suggestions. They are enforced, and not gently. Because remember, these rules are not just about personal behavior. They are about maintaining order. And if order is everything, then breaking it is not a small mistake. It's a threat, which means the response needs to be strong enough to prevent it from happening again, not just for you. For everyone watching, punishments can range depending on what you've done. Minor offences might result in fines or forced labour. More serious ones, especially those involving theft, corruption, or disrespect toward authority, can escalate quickly, very quickly. Because the goal is not just to correct behaviour, it's to discourage it. Publicly, clearly, in a way that makes everyone else think, I will not be doing that. And in a society where stability depends on people following rules consistently, that approach works. Of course, this doesn't mean the system is purely brutal. There is structure here too. Investigations, records, testimonies, handled by the same administrative system that controls everything else. Because even punishment must follow order. You don't want chaos while trying to prevent chaos. That would defeat the purpose. But once a decision is made, it is carried out, and it is remembered. Because consequences need to be visible. You need to see what happens when someone steps out of line. You need to understand that the rules are real, that they matter, that ignoring them is not worth the risk. So you adapt, not just out of fear, but out of understanding, because by now you see the pattern. Every rule, every system, every expectation leads back to the same idea. Keep things stable, keep things predictable, keep things functioning. And if someone threatens that, they are corrected, firmly. So yes, the punishments are harsh, but in a world where a single disruption can ripple outward and affect everything, harshness becomes part of the design. Because in ancient Egypt, order is not optional, and neither is enforcing it. By now you might be thinking, these rules are everywhere. What you eat, how you clean yourself, how you behave, how you work, how you die. Every part of your life seems carefully structured, observed, and controlled. And that's because in ancient Egypt, there is no separation between daily life and religion. They are the same thing. You don't practice religion at certain times. You live inside it. From the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, everything you do has meaning. Not just practical meaning, but spiritual meaning. Washing isn't just hygiene, it's purification. Eating isn't just survival, it's alignment with order. Working isn't just labour, it's contributing to ma'at, the balance that keeps the entire world from quietly falling apart. And because everything is tied to something bigger, the rules don't feel optional. They feel necessary, because ignoring them isn't just inconvenient, it's dangerous. Not always immediately, not always visibly, but in a way that suggests consequences will eventually find you, either in this life or the next, which is a very effective way to keep people consistent. Because you're not just being watched by other people, you're being watched by the gods, always, quietly, with the kind of patience that makes ignoring them feel like a very poor long-term strategy. Of course, this also simplifies things. You don't have to question every rule individually. You don't have to analyze whether something is worth following, because if it's part of the system, it matters. So you follow it, not just out of habit, but out of belief. And even if that belief varies from person to person, the structure remains the same. Everything is connected, everything serves a purpose, everything contributes to maintaining balance. And when a society fully integrates its rules into its worldview like this, those rules become incredibly stable, because they are no longer external. They are internal. They shape how you think, how you act, how you understand the world around you. Which means you don't just follow the system. You become part of it, completely. And in a civilization that lasted thousands of years, that level of integration is not an accident. It's the reason it worked. Because when religion is not separate from life, you don't have to enforce behavior as much. People enforce it themselves. And that might be the most effective rule of all. At this point, you've lived it. The shaving, the washing, the food rules, the cats that clearly outrank you, the makeup that doubles as medicine, the untouchable ruler, the restricted knowledge, the carefully preserved dead, the tombs that are basically ancient security systems, the strict work structure, the surprisingly competent medicine, the constant pressure to maintain order, the punishments that make sure you don't test the system, and a worldview where religion is not part of life, it is life. And when you look at it all together, something shifts, because none of it feels random anymore. It feels intentional. In ancient Egypt, these rules are not there to make life difficult. They are there to make life work, because you are living in an environment that is beautiful, but unforgiving. Heat, disease, limited resources, dependence on a single river. Everything around you has the potential to go wrong. So instead of reacting to problems as they appear, the Egyptians build a system that prevents them, or at least reduces them. You shave to avoid parasites. You wash to avoid illness. You avoid certain foods to prevent contamination. You protect animals that protect your food supply. You structure labour so massive projects don't collapse into chaos. You preserve the dead because your beliefs and your identity extend beyond life itself. You control knowledge to maintain consistency. You enforce rules to protect stability. And you tie everything together with belief, so people follow the system not just out of fear, but out of understanding, or at least acceptance, which is incredibly effective, because when a system is both practical and meaningful, it lasts. And this one lasted for thousands of years. That's not luck. That's design. Of course, from the outside, it still looks strange. Shaving your entire body, worshipping cats, wearing heavy eyeliner in the desert, building tombs like you're expecting a very determined intruder in the afterlife. It's a lot, but from the inside, it makes perfect sense, because every weird rule is solving a real problem, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, but always with a purpose. And that's the part that's easy to miss, because it's easy to laugh at the rules. It's harder to realize they worked. So yes, ancient Egypt had strange rules, very strange rules, but they also had something else. A system that kept people alive, organized, and functioning in a world that did not make that easy. And honestly, when you look at it like that, it's not weird at all. It's just very well thought out. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the air grows thin and the silence feels almost deliberate, stood the sacred sanctuary of Delphi. To the ancient Greeks, this wasn't just an important place. It was the place, the centre of the world, the exact point where the divine brushed against the mortal. Because naturally, if the gods were going to leave a voicemail for humanity, they'd pick a dramatic mountain setting. At the heart of Delphi stood the temple of Apollo, god of light, truth, music, and conveniently, future predictions. But Apollo didn't speak directly. That would be far too simple. Instead, he chose a human vessel, a woman known as the Pythia. Now, imagine the pressure of that job. You're not just offering advice, you're speaking for a god. No pressure, just the fate of entire kingdoms resting on your words. The Pythia was usually an older woman, often from a modest background. No royal blood, no grand education, which makes this even more interesting, because once she entered the temple, sat upon her sacred tripod, and inhaled whatever mysterious vapours rose from beneath the earth, she transformed. Her voice changed, her posture shifted, and suddenly she was no longer just a woman. She was Apollo's mouthpiece. Visitors came from everywhere. Kings, generals, philosophers, desperate citizens, each one climbing the steep path to Delphi, carrying offerings and questions. Should we go to war? Should we found a new city? Should I trust my brother? Or is he plotting my downfall like every sibling in ancient history apparently was? And the answers they received were not exactly straightforward. The Pythia didn't give clear yes or no responses. That would ruin the suspense. Instead, she spoke in riddles. Cryptic, poetic, and often frustratingly vague. The kind of advice that sounds brilliant, until you realise it can mean completely opposite things, depending on how badly you want it to. And yet people believed. Entire armies moved because of her words. Empires made decisions based on her whispers. Delphi became less of a temple and more of a control centre for human destiny. Which raises the question, was this truly divine prophecy? Or was it something far more human? Just wrapped in smoke, ritual, and a very convincing performance. Because as sacred as Delphi was, it was also a system. And like any system involving power, belief, and a crowd of anxious people looking for answers, it may not have been as pure as it seemed. But if the Pythia was the voice of a god, the real question is, how did that voice actually work? Because prophecy, as it turns out, wasn't just about sitting dramatically on a chair and speaking in riddles. There was a full process behind it, carefully controlled, deeply ritualistic, and just a little bit theatrical. It all began before sunrise, on specific days of the month, because even divine communication apparently had a schedule. The Pythia would prepare herself through purification. She bathed in the sacred waters of the Castalian spring, a ritual meant to cleanse both body and mind. Whether it actually removed impurities or just made the whole experience feel more official is up for debate. Then came the sacrifice. A goat, usually. If the goat shivered when water was poured over it, that was a good sign. If it didn't, well, no prophecy that day, which means the fate of entire cities could hinge on whether a goat felt a little chilly. Ancient decision-making at its finest. Once the signs were favourable, the Pythia entered the temple of Apollo and took her place on a tripod, a three-legged stool positioned above a sacred chasm. According to tradition, vapours rose from this crack in the earth, carrying divine inspiration straight into her lungs. Now, whether these vapours were mystical gases, natural geological emissions, or just a convenient explanation for unusual behaviour, no one can say for certain. But what happened next was undeniable. The Pythia would begin to change. Her breathing became irregular, her body swayed. Her voice shifted into something strained, almost unrecognisable. Some accounts describe her as calm and poetic. Others claim she screamed, muttered, or spoke in fragments that barely made sense. Not exactly the polished oracle experience you might expect, but perhaps that unpredictability made it feel more authentic. And here's where things get even more interesting. She didn't deliver neatly packaged prophecies herself. Instead, priests of the temple stood nearby, listening carefully, interpreting her words, and translating them into something more presentable. Usually in poetic verse, because if you're going to confuse people, you might as well do it elegantly. So what people received wasn't just the voice of the Pythia. It was the voice of the Pythia, filtered through a group of highly educated priests, shaped into riddles that could mean almost anything. Which makes you wonder, were people hearing the voice of a god, or the voice of a system that had perfected the art of saying everything, while committing to nothing at all? And yet, despite the ambiguity, people didn't just listen to the Oracle of Delphi. They obeyed it. This wasn't casual advice. This was authority. The kind that could move armies, shape borders, and decide the fate of entire civilizations. And the most fascinating part, no one really questioned it. Or at least not publicly. Because when your decisions are backed by Apollo himself, arguing against it feels risky. City-states across ancient Greece treated Delphi like a divine headquarters. Before wars, leaders would make the long journey up the mountain, bringing offerings, gold, silver, statues, hoping for clarity. Should we attack? Should we defend? Should we wait? And the oracle would respond, in a way that was just clear enough to sound meaningful, but vague enough to avoid responsibility. Take one of the most famous examples. A king once asked whether he should go to war. The oracle replied that if he did, a great empire would fall. Encouraged, he marched forward, only to discover later that the empire destroyed was his own. Technically accurate. Emotionally devastating. This was the genius of Delphi. The prophecies didn't need to be right in a straightforward way. They just needed to feel right. And when they didn't, interpretation took care of that. People would reinterpret the words, adjust their understanding, and somehow still find a way to believe. But belief alone doesn't explain the oracle's power. Delphi was also deeply connected to politics. Priests controlled access to the Pythia. They decided who got to ask questions, when, and how. Wealthy visitors could bring larger offerings, secure better positioning, and possibly receive more attention. In other words, even divine wisdom had a bit of a premium tier. And this created something far more influential than simple prophecy. It created a system of influence. Leaders didn't just seek guidance, they sought validation, a divine stamp of approval that could justify their decisions to their people. After all, it's much easier to convince your citizens to go to war if you can say, "The gods told us to." So Delphi became more than a spiritual center. It became a tool, one that could reinforce power, guide decisions, and shape history, all while maintaining the illusion that everything was guided by something higher. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the oracle wasn't just predicting the future, but quietly helping to create it? If there was one thing the Oracle of Delphi mastered, it wasn't prophecy, it was ambiguity. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The oracle was rarely, if ever, clearly wrong. But that wasn't because she was always right. It was because her words were crafted in a way that made being wrong almost impossible. Take the structure of a typical prophecy. It wasn't direct, it wasn't simple, and it definitely wasn't helpful if you were looking for clear instructions. Instead, it came wrapped in poetic language, layered meanings, and just enough mystery to keep everyone guessing. And that wasn't accidental. Ambiguity was the oracle's greatest weapon. It allowed one statement to carry multiple interpretations at once. If events turned out one way, the prophecy could be read in that direction. If things went differently, well, clearly you just misunderstood it. The gods were never wrong. You were. It's a perfect system, really. And people didn't just accept this. They leaned into it. They analysed every word, every phrase, searching for hidden meanings. Entire decisions were based not on what was said, but on what people thought was meant, which, as you can imagine, opened the door to a lot of creative interpretation. But this raises an interesting question. Were the prophecies intentionally vague to protect the oracle's reputation, or was there something deeper going on? Because in a strange way, ambiguity made the oracle more powerful. It forced people to engage, to think, to project their own fears and desires onto the words. The prophecy didn't just guide decisions, it reflected the mindset of the person hearing it. If you were confident, you heard encouragement. If you were afraid, you heard warning. The oracle became less of a voice from the gods and more of a mirror, showing people exactly what they were already thinking, just dressed in divine language. And that's where things get fascinating. Because maybe the power of Delphi wasn't in predicting the future at all. Maybe it was in influencing how people interpreted their present, giving them just enough guidance to act, but never enough to remove responsibility. So when things went wrong, the blame didn't fall on the oracle. It fell on the human who chose how to understand her words, which might be the most brilliant design of all. A system where the gods speak, but humans take the consequences. And if the Oracle of Delphi was built on ambiguity, then history is full of people who paid the price for misunderstanding it. Because these weren't small personal questions. These were kings, rulers, and entire civilizations asking what they should do next. And the answers they received, however poetic, often led directly to disaster. One of the most famous cases involves Croesus, a man so wealthy his name practically became a synonym for riches. At the height of his power, Croesus faced a critical decision. Should he go to war against the rising Persian Empire? So, like any reasonable ancient king, he went to Delphi. The oracle told him that if he crossed the river and attacked, a great empire would fall. Now, if you're Croesus, sitting on piles of gold and confidence, that sounds like a green light. So he marched. He attacked, and he lost badly. The empire that fell was his own. Technically, the oracle was correct, which is both impressive and deeply unhelpful. Then there's the story of Oedipus, a man whose entire life became a cautionary tale about prophecy. He was told he would kill his father and marry his mother. Naturally, he did everything he could to avoid that fate. He fled, changed his path, tried to outsmart destiny itself. And in doing so, he fulfilled the prophecy perfectly, which raises a disturbing pattern. The oracle didn't just predict events, it often set them in motion. People heard the prophecy, reacted to it, and through their actions, brought it to life. It's almost like the prophecy wasn't describing the future, it was triggering it. And that made Delphi incredibly powerful, because once you believed in the prophecy, your decisions were no longer entirely your own. You were acting in response to something you thought was inevitable, and that belief alone could shape outcomes. But not all prophecies led to ruin. Some guided victories, alliances, and successful expansions, which only strengthened Delphi's reputation. After all, if it works sometimes, and explains itself when it doesn't, that's more than enough to keep people coming back. And they did, again and again. Because when you're facing uncertainty, when the stakes are high, and the future feels impossible to read, even a vague answer from a mysterious priestess on a mountain starts to sound like the best option available, even if history keeps proving otherwise. By now the pattern is hard to ignore. The Oracle of Delphi spoke with divine authority, but the outcomes often depended on human interpretation, which leads to a much more uncomfortable question. Who was really in control? Because while the Pythia sat at the centre of it all, she wasn't alone. Surrounding her was a structured system. Priests, attendants, temple officials, all responsible for maintaining the sanctuary of Apollo, and more importantly, for managing access to the oracle itself. Not everyone could just walk in and ask a question. There were procedures, offerings, waiting lists, and, unsurprisingly, influence. Wealthy city-states and powerful individuals often received priority. Larger offerings meant better access, more attention, and possibly more carefully framed responses. In other words, the closer you were to power, the closer you were to the voice of the gods. And then there were the priests. These were educated men, trained in language, poetry, and religious tradition. When the Pythia spoke, often in fragmented, unclear phrases, it was the priests who interpreted her words, shaped them, and presented them to the visitors in a more refined form, usually poetic, always ambiguous, conveniently flexible, so what people heard wasn't raw prophecy. It was edited prophecy, and once you realize that, everything shifts, because now the oracle isn't just a spiritual phenomenon, it's an institution, one with structure, hierarchy, and influence. A place where divine messaging passes through very human filters before reaching its audience. That doesn't necessarily mean it was all manipulation. Belief in Delphi was genuine. The rituals were sacred. The experience felt real. But within that system, there was room, plenty of room, for subtle guidance. Guidance that could favour certain outcomes, encourage certain decisions, or gently steer powerful figures in directions that aligned with broader interests. After all, Delphi wasn't isolated from the world, it was deeply connected to it. City-states competed, alliances shifted, and politics constantly evolved. And sitting quietly above it all was a sanctuary that everyone trusted. A sanctuary whose words could influence everything. So maybe the oracle wasn't a puppet. But she also wasn't entirely independent, because behind the voice of the gods stood a network of humans, interpreting, shaping, and delivering those divine messages. And in that space between divine inspiration and human interpretation is where the real power of Delphi may have truly lived. And yet, even if the Oracle of Delphi was influenced by priests, rituals, and human systems, none of it would have mattered without one crucial ingredient: belief. Because Delphi didn't just function as a religious site, it functioned as a psychological engine, a place where uncertainty met authority, and where people, desperate for answers, were more than willing to accept whatever they were given. Think about it. You've travelled for days, maybe weeks. You've brought offerings, climbed the sacred slopes, and entered a space everyone around you treats as holy. The air feels different. The rituals are precise. The atmosphere is heavy with expectation. You're already halfway convinced before the oracle even speaks. And when she does, when the Pythia, under the influence of Apollo, begins to speak in that strange, altered voice, you're not analysing her words logically. You're absorbing them emotionally, because you want them to be true. This is where Delphi becomes less about prophecy and more about human psychology. The oracle didn't need to force belief. People arrived believing, and once they heard the prophecy, their minds did the rest. They interpreted, justified, and reshaped the message until it aligned with what they feared, or hoped, would happen. It's a powerful loop. You believe in the oracle. You hear a prophecy. You act based on that prophecy. Your actions help create the outcome, which then reinforces your belief, and suddenly the oracle seems infallible. But here's the deeper layer. The oracle also provided something incredibly valuable: certainty, or at least the illusion of it. In a world filled with unpredictable wars, fragile alliances, and constant risk, Delphi offered guidance. Even if that guidance was vague, it was still something to hold on to, and humans hate uncertainty. We prefer a confusing answer over no answer at all, because at least a confusing answer gives us direction. It gives us a story to follow. So Delphi thrived not just because of religion or politics, but because it understood something fundamental about human nature. People don't just want to know the future, they want to feel like the future is knowable, and the oracle gave them exactly that, even if, in reality, the answers were coming less from the gods, and more from the minds of the people who believed in them. But systems like Delphi don't last forever. For centuries, the Oracle of Delphi stood at the centre of the ancient world, guiding kings, shaping wars, and whispering decisions into history. But slowly, almost quietly at first, its power began to fade. The world was changing. The rise of larger empires, first the Macedonians, then the Romans, shifted the balance of power. Leaders no longer relied as heavily on divine consultation when they had armies, bureaucracies, and expanding territories to manage. Strategy began to matter more than prophecy, logistics more than riddles. Even the Romans, who respected Greek traditions, treated Delphi differently. Some emperors consulted the oracle, but others saw it as more of a cultural relic than a source of real guidance. And when powerful rulers stop believing, everyone else starts to follow. But political change was only part of the story. Over time, the reliability of the oracle seemed to decline. Ancient writers began to notice that the prophecies were becoming less frequent, less impactful, and perhaps less convincing. Whether this was due to changes in the rituals, the environment, or simply growing skepticism, the effect was the same. The mystery was fading, and then came a much bigger shift. The rise of new belief systems, particularly Christianity, challenged the very foundation of places like Delphi. The idea of multiple gods speaking through priestesses no longer aligned with the emerging worldview of a single all-powerful deity. Slowly, traditional pagan practices began to lose support. By the time of Theodosius I in the late 4th century, the change was irreversible. Pagan temples were closed, rituals were banned, and Delphi, once the voice of the gods, fell silent. No final prophecy, no dramatic ending, just silence. The sacred fires went out, the temple emptied, the Pythia spoke no more, and what remained was a place that had once shaped the fate of civilizations, now reduced to ruins and memory. Which is almost poetic in a way, a system built on interpreting the future, unable to predict its own end. Because in the end, Delphi wasn't destroyed by war or disaster. It was simply outgrown, left behind by a world that no longer needed its answers. So after everything, the rituals, the riddles, the influence over kings and empires, we're left with one final question. Was the Oracle of Delphi truly a voice of the gods, or one of the most sophisticated systems of persuasion ever created? Because when you strip away the sacred language and dramatic setting, what remains is something surprisingly familiar, a place where people came seeking answers, a figure who spoke in ways that could be interpreted multiple ways, a system that filtered those words through educated intermediaries, and an audience that believed so strongly they helped make those words come true. From one angle, it's easy to see Delphi as a kind of illusion, a carefully constructed experience designed to guide decisions without ever being directly accountable. The ambiguity, the rituals, the authority, it all worked together to create the impression of divine certainty, even when the answers were anything but. But that's only half the story, because even if the oracle wasn't predicting the future in a literal sense, it was still incredibly powerful. It influenced behaviour, it shaped choices, it gave people a framework to act within, and in doing so, it didn't just reflect the future, it helped create it. In other words, Delphi didn't need to be magically accurate to be effective, it just needed people to believe. And belief, as history has shown again and again, can move armies, build empires, and reshape the world just as much as any real prophecy. So maybe the oracle wasn't a fraud, but it also wasn't a simple divine hotline either. It was something in between, a fusion of faith, psychology, ritual and power, a place where humans reached upward for answers, and ended up discovering more about themselves than about the gods. And maybe that's the real legacy of Delphi, not the predictions it made, but the way it revealed just how far people are willing to go to find certainty in an uncertain world. Because whether it was Apollo speaking through the Pythia, or humanity speaking through belief itself, the oracle always gave people what they were really looking for, not the future, but meaning. In the heart of Constantinople, where empires met and worlds collided, there rose a structure so vast, so ambitious, it seemed less like a building, and more like a challenge to the heavens themselves. This was the Hagia Sophia, commissioned by Justinian I in the year 532. It wasn't meant to simply replace the church that had been destroyed during riots. That would have been too modest. Justinian wanted something that would erase the past entirely, something so magnificent that no one would even remember what came before, and he got exactly that. Built in just a few years, a pace that feels almost suspiciously fast for something this massive, the Hagia Sophia rose with a scale the world had never seen. Its most astonishing feature was the dome, a vast floating canopy of stone that seemed to hover above the earth without effort. Supported by hidden engineering and flooded with light from dozens of windows, it created an illusion that must have felt divine. Imagine walking inside for the first time. Gold mosaic shimmered across the walls. Light poured in from above, reflecting off polished marble floors. The air itself seemed to glow. It wasn't just architecture, it was an experience. A carefully designed moment meant to convince you that you had stepped out of the ordinary world and into something sacred. And that was the point. Because the Hagia Sophia wasn't just a place of worship, it was a statement. A declaration that the Byzantine Empire didn't just follow God, it stood closer to him than anyone else. There's even a story that when Justinian first entered the completed building, he looked up at the dome and declared that he had surpassed Solomon, the legendary builder of the Great Temple in Jerusalem. Modest? Not exactly. But it tells you everything about the mindset behind this place. This was architecture as power, faith transformed into stone. But what makes the Hagia Sophia truly extraordinary isn't just how it was built, it's what it survived. Because over the next 1500 years, this building would outlive emperors, outlast entire empires, and transform again and again, without ever losing its identity. A church, a mosque, a museum, and somehow still the same structure, standing, watching and silently recording history as it unfolded around it. But for all its symbolism, all its power, and all its religious meaning, the true miracle of the Hagia Sophia was something far more unexpected. It was engineering. Because that massive dome, the one that seemed to float effortlessly above the interior, should not have worked. Not by the standards of the 6th century, not at that scale, not with the materials they had, and yet somehow it did. The architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, approached the problem differently. Instead of relying on traditional methods, they designed something bold, something experimental. They used a system of pendentives, curved triangular sections that allowed a circular dome to rest on a square base. Now, that might not sound revolutionary, but at the time it was. It allowed the dome to rise higher, wider and more open than anything before it. Instead of heavy solid walls, the structure distributed its weight in a way that felt almost invisible. And then they added the windows, 40 of them, placed at the base of the dome. When sunlight streamed through, it broke the boundary between stone and sky. The dome didn't just sit there, it glowed. It appeared suspended, as if it were hanging by light itself. To the people standing below, this wasn't architecture. It was a miracle. But here's the catch. It almost didn't last. Just a couple of decades after its completion, the original dome collapsed during an earthquake, which is not exactly what you want from your eternal symbol of divine perfection. But instead of abandoning the project, the Byzantines rebuilt it, stronger, slightly higher, and more stable. And that pattern would repeat. Earthquakes would strike, sections would crack, repairs would be made, again and again. The Hagia Sophia became less of a finished building and more of a living structure, constantly adapting, constantly evolving, which in a strange way makes it even more impressive, because it wasn't just built once and left untouched. It survived, through engineering risks, natural disasters, and centuries of wear. That dome remained, sometimes fragile, sometimes reinforced, but always there, still floating above the space below, still defying expectations, and perhaps most importantly, still convincing everyone who stood beneath it that what they were looking at couldn't possibly be human, even though it was. And once that impossible dome stood firm above Hagia Sophia, the building became something far greater than architecture. It became the beating heart of an empire. For the people of Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia wasn't just a church you visited on special occasions. It was the centre of religious life, the place where emperors were crowned, where victories were celebrated, and where the divine authority of the state was put on full display. Because in the Byzantine Empire, religion and power weren't separate. They were fused. The emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was God's representative on earth, and the Hagia Sophia was the stage where that idea came to life. Every ceremony inside its walls was designed to reinforce that connection. The gold mosaics, the chanting choirs, the clouds of incense. It all created an atmosphere where politics felt sacred and faith felt absolute. Imagine standing inside during one of these ceremonies. The emperor enters, surrounded by officials, moving slowly beneath the vast dome. Light pours down from above, reflecting off gold surfaces. Voices echo across the space, blending into something almost hypnotic. And in that moment, it doesn't feel like you're watching a man. It feels like you're witnessing something ordained. That's the power of the Hagia Sophia. It didn't just house religion, it performed it. And through that performance, it strengthened the empire itself. But beneath all that grandeur there were tensions, because not everyone agreed on what that true faith should look like. The Byzantine world was full of theological debates, sometimes subtle, sometimes explosive. Questions about the nature of Christ, the role of icons, the authority of the church. These weren't just academic arguments, they were political. Disagreements could lead to unrest, riots, even violence, and the Hagia Sophia often found itself at the centre of these conflicts, not just as a backdrop, but as a symbol of what was at stake. Whoever controlled the Hagia Sophia controlled the message, and for centuries that message remained clear. This was the centre of the Christian world, a place where heaven and empire met under one vast dome. But as history would prove, no empire holds the centre forever, and one day the city that surrounded the Hagia Sophia would fall, changing its identity forever. And for centuries the illusion held. The Byzantine Empire endured. The great dome of the Hagia Sophia still hovered above its people. The ceremonies continued. The emperor still stood beneath it, crowned in light and certainty. But outside those walls the world was shifting, and in 1453 it finally broke. The city of Constantinople, once considered unbreakable, was under siege by the forces of Mehmed II. For weeks the walls held. Cannons thundered. Defenders fought desperately, but the empire that had stood for over 1,000 years was now fragile, exhausted, and outmatched. And then the walls fell. What followed was chaos. The city was overrun, streets filled with fear. And as panic spread, many people fled to the Hagia Sophia, believing its sacred status might protect them. If any place could be spared, if any place still held divine protection, it would be this. Inside, crowds gathered. Prayers were whispered. Some say a final liturgy was held as the sounds of the city collapsing echoed outside. The massive doors were closed. For a moment, it must have felt like time had stopped. But history doesn't stop. The Ottomans entered the city, and eventually they reached the Hagia Sophia. The doors were broken open, and just like that, the illusion of safety shattered. The building that had symbolized Christian dominance for centuries was now in the hands of a new power. The empire it represented, gone. Its authority ended. Its identity about to change. But here's what's remarkable. The Hagia Sophia wasn't destroyed. It wasn't burned or reduced to ruins like so many other conquered symbols. Instead, Mehmed II made a different decision. He claimed it. Almost immediately, the Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. Christian symbols were covered, Islamic elements were introduced, and the building, without moving a single stone, began a new chapter. Same walls, same dome, completely different meaning, which is what makes this moment so powerful. Because the fall of Constantinople didn't just end an empire, it transformed one of the most iconic buildings in history into something entirely new. Not by destroying it, but by redefining it. And just like that, the identity of the Hagia Sophia shifted. Not through destruction, but through transformation. After the fall of Constantinople, Mehmed II wasted no time. He entered the Hagia Sophia, looked up at that vast, still intact dome, and saw not an enemy monument, but an opportunity. Because this building was too important to erase. Instead, it would be reborn. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque. But the transformation wasn't immediate in the way you might imagine. The structure itself remained largely unchanged. The dome still floated above. The marble floors still reflected light. The scale, the atmosphere, that overwhelming sense of awe was preserved. What changed was the meaning layered onto it. Christian mosaics depicting Christ, saints and emperors were covered, not destroyed, but hidden beneath plaster. Arabic calligraphy began to appear. Verses from the Quran replaced earlier inscriptions. A mihrab was added, indicating the direction of Mecca. Minarets rose outside, giving the building a new silhouette against the skyline. It wasn't a replacement, it was an overlay. And that's what makes the Hagia Sophia so unique. Most buildings in history belong to one culture, one religion, one identity. But this one carried multiple lives within the same walls. You could stand inside and feel both worlds, Christian and Islamic, layered on top of each other, separated by time, but never fully erased. And under the Ottoman Empire, the Hagia Sophia regained its status as a central place of worship. It became one of the most important mosques in the empire. Sultans prayed there. Ceremonies were held there. Once again, it stood at the heart of power, but this time under a different faith, which is what makes this transformation so fascinating. Because the Hagia Sophia didn't lose its importance when the empire changed. It adapted. It remained the centre, just for a different world. And in doing so, it proved something rare. That a building doesn't need to stay the same to remain powerful. Sometimes, its strength lies in its ability to carry history, even when that history is rewritten. But this wouldn't be its final transformation, because centuries later, another shift would come. One that would attempt to strip away its religious identity entirely. And as the Hagia Sophia settled into its new identity as a mosque, it didn't fade into the background. It became even more important. Under the Ottoman Empire, the Hagia Sophia was no longer just a converted structure. It was a symbol of victory, legitimacy, and continuity. For Mehmed II, transforming it into a mosque wasn't just practical. It was a statement, a declaration that the Ottomans were now the rightful heirs to the city, and they treated it accordingly. Over the centuries, sultans invested heavily in the building. They didn't tear it down or replace it, they strengthened it, reinforced its walls, added support structures, ensured that the Great Dome, already tested by time and earthquakes, would continue to stand. And then came the additions that defined its new identity. Minarets rose one by one around the structure, giving it the unmistakable silhouette of a mosque. Massive circular medallions bearing Arabic calligraphy were placed inside, displaying the names of Allah, the Prophet Muhammad, and early Islamic leaders. The interior was adapted for Islamic prayer, with carpets covering the marble floors and space oriented toward Mecca. But what's fascinating is what they didn't do. They didn't erase everything. Beneath layers of plaster, the original Byzantine mosaics remained, hidden but intact. Faces of Christ, saints and emperors still watched from behind the walls, unseen but not destroyed. It was as if the building itself was holding on to its past, even as its present evolved. And this duality gave the Hagia Sophia a unique presence. It wasn't purely Ottoman. It wasn't purely Byzantine. It was both. A structure shaped by two empires, carrying the weight of two belief systems, existing in a kind of historical balance. And for the people who entered it, whether as worshippers or visitors, that layered history was impossible to ignore. The echoes of chants from centuries past seemed to linger beneath the recitations of new prayers. The light still fell the same way. The dome still hovered above. And the feeling, that overwhelming sense of awe, remained unchanged. Which is what makes the Hagia Sophia so extraordinary. Empires changed. Faiths shifted. Power moved on. But the building endured, not as a relic of one world, but as a bridge between many. And yet, even this long Ottoman chapter wouldn't last forever, because the next transformation wouldn't come from conquest, but from something far more modern, a decision to turn a sacred space into something neutral. And after centuries of serving as one of the most important mosques of the Ottoman Empire, the Hagia Sophia faced a transformation unlike anything before. Not conquest, not religion, but ideology. In the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, giving way to a new state, the Republic of Turkey. And at the centre of this transformation was Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a leader determined to modernize and secularize the nation. For Ataturk, the future of Turkey wasn't tied to empire or religious authority. It was tied to progress, unity, and a clear break from the past. And the Hagia Sophia stood right in the middle of that past. For nearly 500 years it had been a mosque. For nearly 1,000 years before that, a church. It carried layers of religious identity so deeply embedded that it almost defined the building itself. So Ataturk did something radical. In 1935, the Hagia Sophia was transformed into a museum. No longer a place of worship, no longer exclusively Christian or Islamic, but something entirely different. A cultural monument open to everyone. And for the first time in centuries, those hidden layers began to reappear. The plaster covering the Byzantine mosaics was carefully removed, revealing images that hadn't been seen in generations. Christ, the Virgin Mary, emperors, faces from the building's earliest identity, returned to the light. At the same time, the Islamic elements remained. The calligraphy, the mihrab, the minarets outside. It wasn't a reversal, it was a coexistence. Visitors could now walk through the Hagia Sophia and see its full history at once. Christian imagery alongside Islamic design, Byzantine structure alongside Ottoman additions. A single space holding multiple identities without forcing one to dominate the other. And for many, this felt like the perfect solution. A neutral ground. A place where history could be observed, rather than contested. But of course, nothing that powerful stays uncontested for long. Because while some saw the museum as a symbol of unity, others saw it as a loss, a stripping away of sacred meaning. A building that once belonged to faith, now reduced to a display. And that tension never truly disappeared. It just waited, because even after 1,500 years, the story of the Hagia Sophia wasn't finished, not even close. And for decades, the Hagia Sophia stood as something rare in history, a place where competing pasts were allowed to exist side by side, quietly, without one fully overtaking the other. But that balance didn't last, because history, especially when tied to identity and belief, has a way of resurfacing. In 2020, a decision was made that would once again redefine the Hagia Sophia. The Turkish government, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, officially reconverted the building from a museum back into a mosque. And just like that, the space shifted again. Not physically. The dome still stood, the mosaics remained, the structure unchanged. But symbolically, everything was different. The Hagia Sophia returned to being an active place of Islamic worship, echoing once more with the sound of prayers rather than the quiet footsteps of tourists. For some, this was a restoration, a return to tradition, a reclaiming of identity, a correction of what they saw as a historical interruption. After all, the building had functioned as a mosque for nearly 5 centuries, far longer than it had ever been a museum. But for others, it was something else entirely. A loss, a step away from neutrality, a move that reintroduced division into a space that had briefly stood above it. Critics argued that the museum status allowed the Hagia Sophia to belong to everyone, regardless of religion or background. Changing that, they believed, narrowed its meaning. And so, once again, the Hagia Sophia became more than just a building. It became a symbol, a reflection of modern tensions between past and present, tradition and progress, faith and secularism. Inside, some of the Christian mosaics are now covered during prayer times, maintaining respect for Islamic practices. But they still exist, just as they did centuries ago. Hidden, revealed, hidden again. The layers of history remain intact, even as their visibility shifts. Which is what makes this moment feel so familiar, because the Hagia Sophia has never been static. It has always changed with the world around it. Each empire, each era, each ideology has left its mark. Not by destroying what came before, but by adding to it, reshaping it, redefining it. And now, in the modern world, it continues to do exactly that. Not as a relic of the past, but as a living monument, still evolving, still contested, still deeply connected to the people who claim it. And after everything, the rise and fall of the Byzantine Empire, the power of the Ottoman Empire, and the modern transformation of Turkey, the Hagia Sophia is still standing, unmoved, unbroken, still watching. Because what makes the Hagia Sophia truly extraordinary isn't just its architecture or its beauty or even its religious significance, it's its endurance. Empires that once seemed eternal have vanished. Rulers who walked beneath its dome, convinced of their power, are now just names in history. Entire belief systems have shifted, evolved and clashed within its walls. And yet the building remains. The same dome that hovered above Byzantine emperors now stands over modern visitors. The same walls that echoed with ancient chants still carry sound today. Different voices, different prayers, but the same space. It's almost unsettling when you think about it, because the Hagia Sophia doesn't belong to one moment in time. It belongs to all of them. You can stand inside and feel it. The weight of centuries layered on top of each other. Christian mosaics that once dominated the space. Islamic calligraphy that later defined it. Footsteps of emperors, sultans, priests, and ordinary people, all overlapping in a place that has never truly stopped being important. And maybe that's the real story here. Not whether it's a church, a mosque, or a museum, but how it managed to be all three and still remain itself. Because most buildings are tied to a single identity. Once that identity fades, so does their relevance. They become ruins, relics, forgotten. But not the Hagia Sophia. It adapted, again and again, without collapsing under the weight of its own history. And in doing so, it became something rare. A structure that doesn't just represent the past, but carries it forward. So when you look at it today, you're not just seeing stone and marble. You're seeing 1,500 years of human ambition, belief, conflict and transformation, compressed into a single space. A building that outlived the empires that built it, and will likely outlive many more to come. Long before the world knew the name Nikola Tesla, there was a boy growing up in the quiet village of Smiljan, in what was then the Austrian Empire, who experienced the world in a way that felt almost unnatural. He didn't just imagine things, he saw them. Sudden flashes of light would interrupt his vision, bright, overwhelming bursts that appeared without warning. Alongside them came vivid images, so detailed they felt real. Entire machines would form in his mind, fully built, fully functioning, long before he ever touched a tool. For most people, this would have been disturbing. For Tesla, it became a gift, because while other children played outside, he was building entire worlds inside his head. He could rotate objects mentally, test ideas, fix problems, all without writing anything down. He didn't need sketches. He didn't need prototypes. He could see everything, and that ability would define him. But his childhood wasn't just filled with strange visions. It was shaped by intense expectations. His father, a Serbian Orthodox priest, wanted him to follow a religious path, a stable life, a respected role, something grounded in tradition. Tesla had other plans. From an early age, he was drawn to forces he couldn't fully explain: electricity, energy, motion. He became obsessed with the idea that invisible forces could shape the world, that something you couldn't see could still hold immense power, and perhaps more importantly, could be controlled. There's a story that during a storm, young Tesla watched lightning tear across the sky and didn't feel fear. He felt curiosity. Where others saw chaos, he saw potential. And that difference, small at first, would become everything. Because Tesla wasn't just interested in understanding the world. He wanted to redesign it. But brilliance rarely comes without a cost. Even as a child, his mind never seemed to rest. He struggled with sleep, with intense focus, with compulsive habits that would follow him throughout his life, patterns of thought that pushed him forward, but also isolated him from others. He wasn't like the people around him, and deep down he knew it. But that didn't stop him. If anything, it pushed him further. Because while the world saw a strange, intense boy, what it was really looking at was a mind already operating years, maybe decades, ahead of its time. And that restless mind, the one that never seemed to switch off, only grew more intense as Nikola Tesla got older. Because curiosity for Tesla wasn't casual, it was consuming. As a student, he became obsessed with electricity, not just as a subject, but as a force that could reshape the entire world. While others memorized formulas and passed exams, Tesla went deeper. He didn't just want to understand how things worked. He wanted to improve them, and that's where the problem began. At the time, the dominant system of electricity was direct current, DC. It was simple, reliable, and already being used in early electrical systems. But Tesla saw its limitations immediately. It couldn't travel long distances efficiently. It wasted energy. It felt incomplete. And Tesla had a better idea: alternating current, AC. Instead of flowing in one constant direction, AC would reverse direction rapidly, allowing electricity to travel farther, more efficiently, and with far less loss. To Tesla, it wasn't just an improvement, it was the future. But here's the thing about being ahead of your time: no one believes you. During his studies in places like Graz and later Prague, Tesla became so fixated on his ideas that it started to affect everything else. He pushed himself relentlessly, studying for hours without rest, diving deeper into concepts that most people barely understood. At one point, he claimed he could work for days without sleep, which sounds impressive until you realize it's also a warning sign. Because Tesla didn't just think differently, he lived differently. His mind was always running, always solving, always chasing the next idea. And while that gave him an incredible advantage, it also made him difficult to relate to. Professors doubted him. Peers didn't fully understand him. His ideas were often dismissed as unrealistic. But Tesla didn't stop. If anything, the resistance fueled him. Because in his mind, the answer was already clear. He could see it, perfectly, completely. The system worked. The machines functioned. The world powered by alternating current already existed, at least inside his head. Now he just had to prove it to everyone else. And that would require more than theory. It would require opportunity, which meant leaving everything behind and stepping into a world where ideas were tested not in classrooms, but in competition, and not everyone played fair. And that opportunity, the one Nikola Tesla had been waiting for, didn't exist in Europe. So he left. In 1884, with little more than a letter of recommendation and a mind full of ideas, Tesla arrived in New York City, a place that, unlike the academic halls he had known, didn't care about theory. It cared about results. And more importantly, money. Tesla came with a single goal: to work for Thomas Edison, the most famous inventor of the time, the man who had already built a reputation as a genius and a businessman. If Tesla's ideas were going to become reality, This was where it would happen. And at first, it seemed like the perfect match. Tesla joined Edison's company and immediately began working on improving his electrical systems. He worked long hours, solving complex problems, redesigning inefficient machines, pushing himself even harder than before. For a moment, it looked like everything was finally aligning, but beneath the surface, something wasn't right. Because Tesla and Edison weren't just different, they were opposites. Edison was practical, business-minded, focused on what worked now. He believed in direct current, the system he had already invested in, built infrastructure around, and was making money from. Tesla was a visionary. He wasn't interested in small improvements, he wanted a complete overhaul. Alternating current wasn't just better in his eyes, it was inevitable, and that difference created tension. There's a famous story, whether fully accurate or slightly exaggerated, that Edison once promised Tesla a large financial reward if he could improve his DC generators. Tesla worked tirelessly, delivered results, and when he asked for the promised payment, Edison reportedly laughed it off as a joke. Whether it happened exactly like that or not, the outcome was clear. Tesla felt betrayed, and soon after he left, no safety net, no stable income, just his ideas, and the growing realization that brilliance alone wasn't enough in a world driven by profit. For a time, things got rough. Tesla, the man who could design entire electrical systems in his mind, found himself digging ditches just to survive. A genius, reduced to manual labor. But here's what's important. He didn't give up. Because even in that moment, even at his lowest point, Tesla still believed in one thing. Alternating current would change the world, and he was about to find someone willing to take that bet. And that belief, the one Nikola Tesla refused to abandon, finally found its ally. Enter George Westinghouse. Unlike Thomas Edison, Westinghouse didn't just see Tesla's ideas as interesting. He saw them as profitable. He understood what Tesla had been trying to prove all along, that alternating current could travel farther, power entire cities, and do it more efficiently than anything else available. So he backed him. And just like that, Tesla went from struggling inventor to the center of one of the most intense technological rivalries in history. The war of currents. On one side, Edison and direct current, already established, already funded, already in use. On the other, Tesla and Westinghouse, pushing a system that was newer, more complex, and far more powerful. But this wasn't just a debate about engineering, it was a battle for the future. Because whoever won wouldn't just dominate the industry, they would define how electricity would be used across the entire world, and Edison was not about to lose. He launched a campaign to discredit alternating current. Public demonstrations were staged, where animals were electrocuted using AC to prove how dangerous it was. The message was simple. AC was unstable, unpredictable, deadly. Fear became a tool. And it worked, for a time. Because while AC had clear advantages, it also had something that made people uneasy. It was harder to understand. It didn't feel controlled. It didn't feel safe. But Tesla didn't fight fear with words. He fought it with demonstration. In public exhibitions, he allowed electricity to pass through his own body, lighting lamps without wires, showing that AC could be controlled, harnessed, even beautiful. Where Edison showed danger, Tesla showed possibility, and slowly, perception began to shift. Then came the turning point. The 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Westinghouse and Tesla won the contract to power the entire event using alternating current. Thousands of lights illuminated the fairgrounds, creating a spectacle the world had never seen. Bright, stable, efficient, undeniable. In that moment, the war was effectively decided. Alternating current wasn't just viable, it was superior. And the system Tesla had imagined, years earlier, alone in his mind, was now powering the modern world. But victory came at a cost. Because while Tesla had won the battle, he hadn't won the game. And with the success of alternating current, it should have been the moment where Nikola Tesla finally secured everything. Recognition, wealth, stability. But that's not how it played out. Because while Tesla had helped win the war of currents, the system that would power the modern world, he didn't end up owning it. At the center of this turning point was his partnership with George Westinghouse. Westinghouse had backed Tesla when no one else would. He had invested in alternating current, taken the financial risk, and helped bring Tesla's ideas into reality. But success came with pressure. Westinghouse's company began facing serious financial strain, competing with established systems, building infrastructure, and expanding rapidly. It all added up. Investors were nervous, costs were rising, and at the heart of it all was a contract with Tesla that promised him royalties for every unit of electricity generated using his patents. A contract that, if honoured fully, could have made Tesla incredibly wealthy, but also could have bankrupted Westinghouse. And this is where Tesla made a decision that still feels almost unbelievable. He tore up the contract. Just like that. No legal battle, no negotiation, no attempt to secure his own financial future. He simply gave up the royalties, freeing Westinghouse from the burden, and ensuring that alternating current could continue to spread without collapsing under financial pressure. It was an act of loyalty, or idealism, or maybe both. But it came at a cost. Because while the system expanded, while cities lit up and industries grew, Tesla didn't receive the wealth that should have followed. Others profited. Companies expanded. The world moved forward on the foundation he helped build. And Tesla moved on to his next idea. Because that's the thing about him. He wasn't interested in maintaining success. He was always chasing the next breakthrough, which sounds admirable. Until you realize it meant he was constantly leaving behind opportunities that others would have held on to. He had powered the world, but he didn't control it. And that pattern, brilliance followed by sacrifice, would repeat again and again. Because Tesla wasn't just trying to improve the world, he was trying to transform it entirely. And his next idea would be even bigger, not just powering cities, but sending energy through the air itself. And after helping bring electricity to cities across the world, Nikola Tesla wasn't satisfied, because to him wires were a limitation, a temporary solution, something that solved the problem but didn't perfect it. Tesla believed something far more radical. What if energy didn't need wires at all? What if electricity could be transmitted through the air, freely, instantly, across vast distances? Not just to power cities, but to power the entire planet. It sounds futuristic. Even today. But for Tesla, it wasn't science fiction. It was inevitable, and he set out to prove it. His experiments began with high-frequency currents and wireless transmission over short distances. He developed the Tesla coil, a device capable of producing dramatic electrical discharges, arcs of lightning that seemed almost theatrical, but served a real purpose. They demonstrated that energy could move through space without direct contact. To most people, it looked like a spectacle. To Tesla, it was a glimpse of the future. And then came his most ambitious project, the Wardenclyffe Tower, a massive structure built on Long Island, designed not just to transmit signals, but to transmit power itself. Tesla envisioned a global system where information and energy could be sent wirelessly across the Earth, reaching anyone, anywhere, free energy, accessible to all. No wires, no limits, no control. And that last part was the problem. Because while Tesla saw a world transformed, investors saw something else. A system that couldn't be easily monetized. If energy could be sent freely through the air, how would you charge for it? How would you control it? How would you turn it into profit? One of his main backers, J.P. Morgan, initially supported the project. But once it became clear that Tesla's vision wasn't just about communication, but about free, global energy, the funding stopped. Just like that. Construction slowed, then halted, and eventually, the tower, Tesla's greatest dream, was abandoned, left unfinished, because the world wasn't ready. Or maybe, the system around him wasn't willing, and this marked a turning point, not just in Tesla's work, but in his life. Because from this moment forward, his ideas would grow even more ambitious, but his ability to bring them into reality would begin to fade. And as the dream of wireless power collapsed, something else began to fade with it, Nikola Tesla himself. Because up until that point, Tesla had always been able to recover. Every setback led to another idea. Every failure pushed him towards something new, but this time felt different. Wardenclyffe wasn't just another project. It was the project, the one that was supposed to change everything. And when it failed, it left more than just an unfinished tower. It left a gap that Tesla struggled to fill. Financially, things became unstable. Without consistent backing, Tesla moved from hotel to hotel, often unable to pay his bills. The man who had once stood at the center of the electrical revolution now found himself drifting on the edges of it. But it wasn't just his finances, it was his behavior. Tesla had always been unusual, but as the years went on, those traits became more pronounced. He developed strict routines, obsessions with numbers, particularly the number 3, an intense aversion to germs, a need for extreme precision in everything he did. And then there were the pigeons. Tesla formed a deep attachment to them, especially one white pigeon he claimed to love as a person loves another human being. He fed them daily, cared for them, even brought injured ones into his hotel room. To some it seemed eccentric, to others concerning. But beneath all of this was something deeper: isolation. Because Tesla didn't just live differently, he thought differently. And over time, the gap between him and the rest of the world widened. His ideas became more abstract, more difficult to understand, and sometimes harder to take seriously. He spoke of new inventions, advanced energy weapons, communication systems, technologies that sounded decades ahead of their time. But without funding, without support, they remained ideas, unbuilt, unproven, and slowly the world moved on. Other inventors rose. Other companies expanded. The systems Tesla helped create continued to grow, but without him at the center, which is perhaps the most striking part of his story. Because while the modern world was being powered by his ideas, he was no longer part of it, left behind, not because he lacked brilliance, but because the world he imagined was moving faster than the one that actually existed. And as the world moved forward, lit by the very systems Nikola Tesla had helped create, he slowly disappeared from it. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly. By the 1920s and 30s, Tesla was no longer the celebrated inventor demonstrating electrical wonders to crowds. He was an aging man, living alone in New York hotels, surviving on small stipends and the fading memory of his achievements. The contrast was almost cruel. Cities glowed with alternating current. Industries expanded. New technologies built on the foundations he had helped lay. And yet, Tesla himself struggled to pay for basic necessities. Bills piled up. Hotel managers grew impatient. At times he had to move simply because he could no longer afford to stay. And still, he kept thinking. He continued to speak about new inventions, ideas that sounded almost unreal. He described a death ray, a powerful energy weapon that could end wars by making them impossible to fight. He talked about wireless communication systems that resembled what we now recognize as modern radio, and even aspects of global connectivity. But by this point, the world wasn't listening, because without proof, without prototypes, without funding, his words sounded less like vision and more like fantasy. And that's the tragedy, because Tesla had always lived ahead of his time. But now that distance worked against him. The same mind that once seemed brilliant now seemed disconnected. His reputation faded, not entirely forgotten, but no longer central. He became a figure people remembered vaguely, if at all, a name occasionally mentioned, often overshadowed by others who had been better at turning ideas into business. And yet, in the background, his influence remained everywhere. Every light powered by alternating current, every system built on electrical transmission, every step forward in energy and communication carried pieces of his work. But Tesla himself walked alone. He spent his final years in relative isolation, feeding pigeons, reflecting on a life filled with both extraordinary success and profound loss. A man who had once stood at the forefront of innovation, now watching the world from a distance. And perhaps the most difficult part wasn't the poverty or the obscurity, but the realization that the future he had imagined was arriving, just without him in it.